I'm not a journalist. I come from a different background, as Nabe said, in government. I am somebody, though, who I think in the US system is excited and encouraged about what is happening in Japan. I think there is perhaps a perception, perhaps following the visit of our Secretary of Defense, that Americans are worried, concerned, even alarmed by political change in Japan. Speaking for myself, but I think many of my colleagues, I'd like to reassure you that, in fact, we are following it with great interest, and we are quite encouraged about the direction that Japanese politics is headed in. On the political side, it's rather amazing to me to note that our president, President Obama, has a 90% approval rating in Japan, which any politician in my country would crave. It's also very exciting for us to have gone around this week and to have met with many young reformist ministers and senior officials in the Democratic Party, in government now, coming from the Democratic Party. These are not the people that many Americans used to visit in the ministries. The kind of people we used to visit were, if I can use a phrase without offending anybody, sometimes stuffed shirts, products of backroom deals. And it's very exciting for young people like me to come and meet these ministers, young people who have a lot of zeal and a lot of charisma. It strikes me that this political confluence between our countries should be the foundation for a very dynamic partnership going forward. That moves me to my second point, which is that this, in turn, will produce a different kind of US-Japan alliance. One that is more equal, which Japan is an equal partner, which I think sincerely has been a goal of American policy since at least the mid-90s. A Japan that is growing economically, renewing itself domestically. This also is something that is very much in the interest of the United States and of our alliance. A Japan that enjoys better relations with Asia. Philip mentioned the complications around Japan's relationships with some of its neighbors. Some of these are unquestionably the byproduct of a Cold War alliance that separated Japan from an Asia that we should note looked very different at the time. It was not driven by market economics, much of Asia, certainly before China really opened up. It was not largely democratic, which with the exception of China, it is now. It had not developed to the degree that it has to date, and that development is due very largely, people often forget, to Japanese investment in not only in China, but in Southeast Asia. So it benefits the US-Japan alliance for Japan to have better relations with its neighbors, starting with China. And finally, Americans have embraced this idea, at least for 15 years in Japan policy, this idea of a normal Japan. I think we're going to look to the new government in Japan and the Japanese people to tell us exactly what that means. It was Ichiro Ozawa who coined the term, or popularized it, in the early 90s. And it's now his party that we hope can continue to fulfill that vision. That is very much in America's interest, the interest of the West. So we're encouraged by all of these things. My third point, though, as you all know better than I, is that Japan's political revolution has created strains in our alliance. I won't get into any details, but again, I think the Futenma relocation, some of the issues around basing in Okinawa, these are not causes of a problem between our countries. They are symptoms of questions around the alliance going forward. These are symptoms of a broader phenomenon as we both try to redefine what the US-Japan alliance means and what it will do in this 21st century world. The alliance also, I think, has suffered from domestic factors in both countries. In the United States, there are many senior American officials and friends of Japan who have been coming here for a very long time and who are discomfited by the new faces they meet in the Japanese bureaucracy and in the ministries. They are discomfited by the fact that Democratic Party leaders have been out of government, don't trust the bureaucrats, and therefore don't defer to Americans on alliance matters the way that I think some Americans grew used to. It's not a slight to say that the Democratic Party leadership does not have a lot of national security experience, having been out of power. It's just a fact of life. And so all of these things are creating strains on the alliance at a time when, of course, the Japanese government is consumed with many internal domestic matters. This leads me to my fourth point out of 5, which is that I'd like to make a case to all of our friends in this room that none of the Democratic Party of Japan's goals, none of the DPJ goals, now that it is in government, are achievable without a strong US-Japan alliance. I think the alliance can be a catalyst for many of the DPJ's objectives, rather than an obstacle. In terms of the very intense focus that the new government brings to some of the domestic reform questions, the economic renewal, the welfare issues, the alliance allows Japan to spend much less of its money on guns and much more of it on butter. Perhaps put more clearly, Japan can invest many more of its national resources, as you know, in welfare and domestic goods, rather than investing them, say, as China has done, spending 10–15% of its government budget or its GDP on defense. The alliance, of course, helps prevent tensions between Japan and its neighbors. Setting China aside for a minute, many friends of America in this region, countries around the region, have expressed quiet concern to Americans about what happens if the US-Japan alliance begins to really unravel. What does this mean for America's own posture in this region, the defense guarantees that have underlied Asia's prosperity and dynamism? On the question of China particularly, I would say that it is very difficult for Japan to have a normal, much closer relationship with China without the comfort of the alliance. Rather than standing in the way of Japan-Chinese relations, I would say that part of the reason the Chinese take Japan so seriously, and they do, is because of its relationship with the United States. And that if the alliance really were to fall apart, and this is a worst-case scenario, if it were really to fall apart, Japan would not have an improved relationship with China. I would argue, without going into great detail, that perhaps you'd see the opposite. Japan would have to take necessary measures for its own defense. The Chinese might think that they could bully Japan, perhaps form a G2 with the United States that excluded Japan. So in terms of the new government's very important efforts to improve relations with Beijing, I would argue that the right kind of alliance relationship helps that. Finally on this point, as you all know, I'm sure you're all among them, 75% of the Japanese public supports the alliance. So from a purely political perspective, this new government in Japan does not have a political interest, setting aside all of the security questions, in watching this alliance begin to unravel. So there's a logic here that I hope will hold and that will lead to a closer rather than a more distant alliance relationship. I'd like to close very quickly just by saying, picking up on the points of my colleagues, that the view of Americans, like the view of Europeans of Japan, seems very different from the view of Japan held by many Japanese. The technological and innovative side of Japan, which will really be the cutting edge issues in the global economy in the 21st century. Japan is, of course, a leader, the leader in many of these areas. The economic projections, I said this morning in our seminar, many Japanese have a real crisis of confidence that China may surpass the size of the Japanese economy next year. But even looking out 30–40 years, Japan will still be the third, fourth largest economy in the world, bigger than any European country. That looks pretty good from where we sit. And finally, I think whether it relates to some of these Japan-China questions, Japan-US bilateral questions, relations between Japan and Europe, many Japanese, I think, do not sufficiently take into account, when they are pessimistic about their country's future, that Japan is embedded in a values-based community. It has important relationships, not just with the US, but with Australia, India, Europe, etc. Japan is part of, I would argue, the global community of democracies that will shape the 21st century at least as much as China will, and I would argue more. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.